Where did the journey begin for the American intelligentsia? Who would be the person that you feel started it all?
Ralph Waldo Emerson. Well, you could say his father, because his father was, William Emerson, was a Unitarian minister in Boston at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century. And that's when books started to come here from England by way of India. First translations of Indian texts, first commentaries by British and German scholars about India and Indian religion and teachings. And for the first time, some of those philosophers and scholars began to appreciate the profundity of those teachings as opposed to serving the missionary and colonial effort by denigrating them. And so people in New England at the turn of the 19th century, many of them were fascinated by Asian texts and literature and started societies and journals. And Ralph Waldo Emerson's father was one of them. So he kind of grew up with it. And then when he was a Harvard student, he got more and more into it, and got more and more into it as access to the books became more easy and more books started to arriving, and Sanskrit scholars started to appear in Harvard and places like that. And ultimately, you can trace a great deal of what we think of as Emersonian philosophy to his access to those Indian texts, and he as much as said so. And then, of course, from him, it permeated the culture, because no thinker has ever had bigger impact on American philosophy, American worldview, American literature than Emerson. And of course, the first impact was on Henry David Thoreau, his young acolyte, so to speak. So people now, and all these decades, who have been reading Emerson and reading Walden, reading Thoreau, being inspired by him, they talk
about Walt Whitman.
And then Walt Whitman as well. Those big three.
Big three.
And then, of course, they had tremendous effect on American culture ever since their time. And so they were essentially the first yogis. Emerson was a Unitarian minister, which at that time was very revolutionary, and he even rejected that. He was looking for something more. And he and Thoreau, I believe, and Whitman, some people have an intuition about the nature of life and their connection to the holy or to the transcendent. And the Eastern texts gave them a way to understand what they were experiencing inside, what they were feeling and intuiting, because it had this rational framework that Western religions had lost for explaining the nature of the connection between the individual and the divine and the essential unity of it. And so they were drawn to that. It gave them an alternative way of looking at the world. And so you read in Thoreau and Emerson especially the joy and the insight they drew from these texts. And now people reading them may not even realize they're getting Indian philosophy because they adapted it to their own language and culture.